Mr. President, as presidential candidate, Donald Trump campaigned on a promise to the American people that he would, quote, get tough on immigrants and secure our border. We heard it loud and clear, didn't we? The wall to be built by the Mexicans, accusing Mexicans coming into this country of being murderers and rapists. We heard it over and over and over again. Now, more than two years into the Trump administration, it is clear that the president has failed in his efforts on immigration, especially when it comes to families and children. It is obvious our southern border today is much less secure than it was when Donald Trump took office. Take a look at these numbers. They tell the story, a dramatic story. In fiscal year 2017, here, which was the end of the Obama administration and the beginning of the Trump administration, in 12 months, 303,000 people were apprehended at our border, including 75,000 families and 41,000 unaccompanied children. Now, 2 years later, the numbers are dramatically higher under President Trump's watch. Only 6 months into this fiscal year 2019, 361,000 people have already been apprehended at the border. It was 303,000 over a 12-month period 2 years ago, before the president took office. Now, 361,000 in 6 months, including 189,000 families and 36,000 unaccompanied children. That's more total apprehensions in the first half of this year, in the first 6 months, than all 12 months of 2017. And the Department of Homeland Security has been engulfed in Trumpian chaos. In less than 2.5 years of the Trump administration, there have already been 4 heads of the Department of Homeland Security, 4 in 2.5 years. Secretary John Kelly, Acting Secretary Elaine Duke, Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen, and now Acting Secretary Kevin McAleenan. And within the Department of Homeland Security, there have already been, under this administration, in a little over 2 years, 4 acting directors of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, 3 nominees to head this agency. Under President Trump, ICE has never had a director confirmed by this Republican-controlled Senate, which spends all of its time approving nominees. The Trump administration has never had a director of ICE confirmed because the proposed nominees' names keep changing. In fact, every major position at the Department of Homeland Security is now held by a temporary appointee, not confirmed by the Senate, not confirmed by the Republican-controlled Senate. A major front in President Trump's war on immigrants has been his attack on Dreamers. Dreamers are young immigrants who came to the United States as infants, toddlers, and children. They've gone to school with our kids. They've given back to their communities as teachers and nurses, engineers, and even soldiers. They are American in every way except for their official immigration status. In 2010, I joined with the late Republican Senator Dick Lugar of Indiana on a bipartisan basis, calling on President Obama to use his legal authority to try to protect these Dreamers from deportation. President Obama responded by creating the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program known as DACA. DACA provided temporary 2-year legal status to Dreamers if they stepped forward, paid a filing fee, went through a criminal background check, registered with the government, and had nothing in their background that would disqualify them from staying in the United States. More than 800,000 of these young people came forward. They received DACA protection. DACA has really given them their first chance on a 2-year renewable basis to not be afraid of deportation and to be able to legally work and go to school in the United States. They used that opportunity well. They became soldiers of the United States, engineers, teachers, small business owners, medical professionals. But on September the 5th, 2017, President Donald Trump repealed this program. Hundreds of thousands of dreamers faced losing their work permits and being deported to countries they barely knew. President Trump also terminated the Temporary Protected Status Program, known as TPS, for 300,000 immigrants. TPS allows nationals of another country who are in the United States to stay here legally if it's too dangerous to return to their country. The termination of this program by President Trump jeopardizes the safety of these immigrants, and many of them with American children, who number in the thousands. When he announced the repeal of DACA, President Trump called on Congress to, quote, legalize DACA, close quote. But then he turned around and rejected numerous bipartisan proposals to protect the dreamers. Last year, I worked with Senator Lindsey Graham, the Republican chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, to craft a bipartisan agreement that included the DREAM Act and a path to citizenship for TPS holders. However, President Trump profanely rejected my legislation in a tense meeting in the Oval Office. Instead, the president tried to put the entire hardline immigration agenda on the backs of the dreamers. He said he would only support legalization for these young people if Congress passed his plan, his complete plan, which would, among other things, slash legal immigration by 40%. There's a lot of debate in this country about immigration, for sure. But we usually agree on a couple basics. First, we are a nation of immigrants. Second, many immigrants come to this country and work extremely hard for their families, for their future, creating businesses and opportunities at great personal sacrifice. And the notion, by some, that we would cut back on legal immigration to this country at a time when we desperately need increases in our workforce is so short-sighted. This plan to slash legal immigration by more than 40% by President Trump was rejected by the bipartisan Senate. It would have been the largest cut in legal immigration in almost a century. The president would have taken our nation back to one of the darkest chapters when we were closing immigration to certain groups across the board, discriminating against them in terms that are largely unacceptable to America today. Thank goodness the Senate rejected this plan by a bipartisan supermajority. Yesterday was quite a day here on Capitol Hill. The legislative achievement of the United States Senate yesterday, a unanimous consent request to strike a coin to commemorate women's suffrage. Well, I was happy to support that, but that's what we did yesterday. But what happened across the rotunda in the House of Representatives? Yesterday, the House of Representatives responded to President Trump's cruel decision on DACA and TPS. The House passed the American Dream and Promise Act on a bipartisan vote, 237 to 187. I went over to stand on the floor of the House, where I served for a number of years, just to hear the debate and to thank my colleagues for their leadership. I want to call out especially the statements that were made and the support given by Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Majority Leader Steny Hoyer, Judiciary Committee Chairman Jerry Nadler, Immigration Committee Chair Zoe Lofgren, and the lead sponsors of the bill, Congresswoman Lucille Roybal Allard, Congresswoman Nydia Velazquez, Congresswoman Yvette Clarke, and my friend and fellow Illinoisan Congressman Chuy Garcia. This vote was especially important to me because this legislation that they passed yesterday in the House of Representatives includes the DREAM Act. It was 19 years ago that I introduced the first DREAM Act, bipartisan legislation that would give dreamers a chance to earn their way to legal status and citizenship. Now the eyes of hundreds of thousands of dreamers have moved across the Capitol and are focused on the Senate. They are counting on us to solve the DACA crisis that President Trump has created. Will the Majority Leader, Senator McConnell of Kentucky, give them a chance? I certainly hope so. The Senate should send the American Dream and Promise Act to the President's desk for a signature. The Senate also has a responsibility to address the humanitarian crisis at our southern border, a crisis which this administration has made much, much worse. When this president threatens to shut down the border, which he has on many occasions, it's like a neon sign to the smugglers to use this threat to encourage more desperate families to flee toward our border. When the president says he's going to block all assistance to the Northern Triangle countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, and shut down any avenues for legal migration, he just guarantees that more refugees in desperation will head to our borders. Earlier this year, the president forced the longest government shutdown in the history of the United States, 35 days. 35 days when men and women who serve in our government in important jobs like air traffic control at our airports were denied their pay. Why would the president do this to these men and women and to others, thousands of others in our federal workforce? It was his desperate pursuit of his beloved border wall so that he could fulfill a campaign promise that he told us over and over and over again would be paid for by Mexico. The Trump government shutdown paralyzed our immigration courts. For 35 days, they saw their backlogs increase. There are 300,000 cases pending before those courts. These courts play a critical role in processing cases of immigrants seeking asylum at our border. Now the president, within the last week, has said he will impose tariffs on all goods coming into the United States from Mexico, which will raise prices on American consumers, kill jobs in America, and once again put the burden, the political burden, on farmers across the United States, including in Illinois. The administration and its Republican allies in Congress argue that critical humanitarian protections for families and children are the real problem here. They claim with a straight face that we can better protect these migrants by making it easier to detain them indefinitely and deport them without any due process. But if people were migrating to the United States because of the so-called legal loopholes, which the administration keeps talking about, they would be coming from all over the region. They're not. The vast majority of families and children are coming not from Mexico, but from the three countries in the Northern Triangle that I mentioned earlier. In April, I visited the port of entry in El Paso, Texas, and the nearby Border Patrol station. What I saw in those overcrowded facilities was heartbreaking. There are detention cells where these migrants are being held. Over one of these cells, which has a window that you can look into, over the door it says capacity 35. I counted 150 men standing shoulder to shoulder in that detention cell. They are served their meals and eat them standing up. There's room for maybe 20 or 30 to sit on benches. The rest stand all day and take turns at night lying on the floor. There's not room for them. I've since been told that that cell has increased its numbers from 150 to 200. Next door to that cell was a cell that said outside of the door, capacity 16. Inside that cell, I counted 75 women, including nursing mothers with their babies. I've been told that that number has increased dramatically since as well. How long will they be in these cells? I'm told any day, anywhere from 3 days to 6 weeks. One of the women's cells, as I said, had a capacity of 16. And I looked in there, and it was painful to catch the eyes of those who were being held there. And they mouthed the word, help. It reached a point where over 20 senators have joined me in writing to the International Red Cross, which inspects prison facilities around the world, and asked them to inspect our detention facilities on America's border. It was a sad day to make that request, but it had to be made. I also asked the DHS Inspector General, Acting Inspector General, to investigate these Border Patrol facilities. Last week, the Inspector General's office at DHS released a report detailing the inhumane and dangerous overflow of migrants at the El Paso port of entry. The Inspector General's office found that overcrowding was, quote, an immediate risk to the health and safety of detainees and DHS employees. While we fail to even debate this issue here in Washington, we cannot overlook the inhumane conduct that is occurring at the border. We're better than that. This notion of zero tolerance, where we separated 2,880 infants and toddlers from their parents, some of whom it took months to bring back together, that to me does not speak well of who we are as a nation. Look at this picture that was taken at one of the cells. We blacked out the faces of those, but it gives you an idea of the mass of humanity. The 76 women they counted in the picture that were in a cell for 18 people, some of them with children. The Inspector General's report said that the Department of Homeland Security has been aware of the situation in El Paso for months, but has not identified a process to alleviate overcrowding. Meanwhile, Congress, weeks ago, months ago, passed an emergency appropriation for humanitarian care of these people at the border of hundreds of millions of dollars. It isn't as if we haven't given the administration resources to deal with at least the immediate crisis on their hands. The IG report said that DHS has been aware of this situation for months, but they haven't taken measures to deal with it. This report called on them to take immediate steps. The Department of Homeland Security gave a target completion date for temporary shelters. Their target completion date, November 30th, 2020, a year and a half from now, for the completion of a centralized processing center in El Paso. The Inspector General found this response completely inadequate. So do I. Democrats are serious about addressing this situation. There's some bottom line standards that I think we all should look to. First, we need border security. There's no doubt in my mind. In an age of terrorism, with the worst drug epidemic in the history of the United States, I want to know who's crossing our border and what they're bringing. Every American should want to know. Secondly, there is no excuse for allowing a dangerous person to come in this country. If we know they're dangerous, they're not welcome. And if they're here in any questionable status and a danger to America, they've got to go. Number three, and it pains me to say this as the son of an immigrant woman, pains me to say this, but it's a fact. We cannot absorb all of the people in the world who want to come to the United States. It is not economically or even physically possible for that to happen. We have to have standards when it comes to immigration. But once we've established those three standards, shouldn't we come together, Democrats and Republicans, and rewrite our immigration laws, this broken system that has led to this point? It won't be solved by threats of walls, by threats of closing the borders, by threats of cutting off foreign aid. It makes the situation even worse, and sadly, President Trump has proven that point in the 2 years plus he's been in office. I'm serious about addressing this, deadly serious about what it means to dreamers and people here in temporary protected status. In February, after the president finally ended his government shutdown, I helped write an omnibus appropriation bill. We put $564 million in the bill for inspection equipment so we could scan and x-ray every car and truck coming into the United States, grab the narcotics at the border before they make it to my hometown and yours. I hope we all agree on that. $414 million in that bill for humanitarian assistance. I can't tell you how that's being spent. We could do more to make sure that even in the midst of political controversy, our border is secure and our treatment of these desperate people is humane, and that we will be able to answer to history for how we are conducting ourselves. Democrats have introduced the Central America Reform and Enhancement Act as a comprehensive response to this problem. We need to address the root causes in Northern Triangle countries that are driving these migrants here. We need to crack down on the cartels and traffickers that are exploiting these migrants. We need to provide for in-country processing, which the Obama administration provided for and the Trump administration eliminated. What it meant was residents in those 3 countries did not have to make a dangerous, expensive trip across Mexico to our border to find out if they were eligible for asylum. They could do it in their home country. The Obama administration had this program, the Trump administration eliminated, and people started making that trip across Mexico to test whether or not they were legally eligible to stay in this country. And we eliminate immigration court backlogs in the Democratic bill so that asylum claims can be processed more quickly. We stand ready to work on smart, effective, and humane border security policies. But the president needs to be part of the solution. If this is about his reelection and appealing to his base and being tougher and tougher, I can tell him it's not working, Mr. President. It's not working for the good of this country. Perhaps your political base finds it appealing, but I think American people are now looking for solutions. They want us to work on a bipartisan basis. We have a chance, an opportunity. The House of Representatives' action yesterday, I hope, is the beginning of a meaningful dialogue to deal with this crisis. I yield the floor.